My name is Sebastian Caldwell, age 68. If I were to describe my life in a single phrase, it would be steady, structured, and painfully underestimated. I've spent my entire adulthood building a life with quiet dignity, working diligently in accounting, investing wisely, marrying young, raising a son, and keeping the peace even when the peace wasn't deserved. People never expect much from quiet men. They never suspect that silence can be a strategy. It was Christmas, my favorite holiday. The only time of the year when the brittle cold outside seemed to force people into each other's arms. That Christmas dinner, however, would come to change everything. The dining room in our stately house on Willow Creek Lane looked like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Louise, my wife of 43 years, had gone all out as usual. The centerpiece was a garland of pine and holly, nestled around 4 red candles. Silverware gleamed, polished to a mirror sheen. Every glass had a linen napkin folded inside like a miniature crown. The roast goose sat at the head of the table, steaming, golden brown, and perfectly carved by yours truly. The table was set for 10, Gary and his wife Dana, their 3 children, my daughter Evelyn and her boyfriend Travis, and of course, Louise and me. The air smelled of rosemary, cloves, and baked apples. You might have thought we were the happiest family in the county. Gary stood up just as I reached for the cranberry sauce. He cleared his throat, holding a wine glass between his fingers like a man giving a wedding toast. He wore his confidence like armor, the same way he had since he started working in finance and earning more in a month than I did in a year. "We have all decided," he began, his voice oddly ceremonial, "that we no longer want you in our family." The words didn't register at first. I looked at him, blinking, wondering if this was some poor attempt at a joke, maybe a prank, some bizarre millennial humor, but his face held no hint of jest. Louise didn't gasp. She smiled, tight-lipped and smug, like someone who had been rehearsing this moment in front of a mirror. She folded her napkin and placed it carefully on her lap. I glanced around the table. Evelyn wouldn't meet my eyes. Dana sipped her wine, suddenly very interested in the pattern of the tablecloth. Even the children had gone quiet, as if they had been warned in advance not to interrupt. My heart didn't break, not exactly, but something old and tired inside me sighed its last breath. I didn't flinch, I didn't scowl, I didn't ask why. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a thick brown envelope. I handed it to Gary, who took it with the air of a man expecting a severance check or a title deed. He opened it quickly, with theatrical flair. Then he froze. At first, his mouth didn't move. Then came a twitch. Then came the scream. "No! No! What is this? What the hell is this?" Louise leaned in, snatching the papers from his hands. Her eyes scanned the first page, and the color drained from her face. Dana reached for the envelope next, pulling out document after document. Evelyn looked like she might be sick. The room fell into stunned silence. The air turned heavy, the flickering candles now casting long, uncertain shadows. I reached for my wine glass, took a sip, and savored the taste, dry, bold, with the rich finish of vindication. 10 months. It had taken me 10 months to prepare that folder. 10 months of meetings, lawyers, notaries, financial consultants. 10 months of listening, of pretending I didn't see the late-night texts Louise tried to hide, of watching Gary flirt with betrayal under the guise of family loyalty, of Evelyn pulling further and further away. Because I knew this day would come. I just didn't know how poetic it would be. "Sebastian," Louise finally whispered, her voice trembling, "what have you done?" I stood, adjusting the sleeves of my navy suit, the one she'd always said made me look too serious. "You wanted to cut me out of the family," I said calmly. "I merely made sure that you wouldn't be cutting me out of what really matters, Gary's eyes darted across the papers. You, you moved everything. The trust fund, the house, the investments. It's all gone. Not gone, I corrected. Just redirected. Louise stood now, papers in hand, her hands trembling. You can't do this. This house is half mine. I looked at her, not angry, just exhausted. It was. But you signed those refinance documents without reading the fine print. You wanted me out, Louise. You got your wish. But you don't get to keep the rewards. Dana whispered something to Gary, but he shoved her hand away. Evelyn still hadn't spoken. Her boyfriend Travis looked as if he wanted to disappear. You see, I continued, addressing the table. When you raise a child and love a wife for decades, you learn where they hide their sharpest knives, and you learn how to beat them to the draw. I reached into my pocket again and placed a second envelope on the table. This one was thinner. This is a list of the charities now benefiting from your inheritance, I said. The Cancer Research Foundation, the Veterans Relief Fund, and a scholarship for underprivileged students in my mother's name. Gary lunged forward, but Louise stopped him. Her face was pale, eyes hollow. Merry Christmas, I said, placing my napkin gently on my plate. And thank you for making it so easy to say goodbye. I turned and walked out of the dining room, the echoes of disbelief and shattered entitlement following me down the hallway. The envelope had changed everything, but it was only the beginning. The dishes had barely cooled, and the wine glasses still shimmered in the aftermath of dinner when Gary cornered me in the study. Louise was upstairs consoling Dana, who had retreated to their guest room with trembling hands and blotchy mascara. Evelyn and Travis had slipped out into the cold, pretending they had somewhere else to be. I sat by the fireplace, the only light in the room casting long shadows that flickered across the shelves of worn books and framed photographs, some of which I realized I might soon remove. Gary didn't bother with small talk. Dad, we need to talk. Do we? I replied, keeping my eyes on the fire. He paced, his arms rigid, fists balled at his sides. I don't know what you think you proved with that stunt back there, but this isn't over. No, I said, my voice calm. It isn't. Not for you. He ignored the jab. This house is falling apart. The plumbing, the roof, the furnace. It's all ancient. If you'd just be reasonable and give us the money to fix it up, we could work something out. Work something out, I repeated, amused. Like a business deal? This place is an investment, Dad. We could rent it out, maybe sell in a few years. You holding on to it is just selfish. Selfish. That word settled over the room like dust. I looked at Gary, my son, the boy I had once carried on my shoulders at the state fair, the boy who used to beg for bedtime stories, who once cried when he scraped his knee on the driveway. You're not asking for repairs, Gary, I said slowly. You're asking for control. You want this house, not because it needs care, but because you think you're entitled to it. His jaw tightened. You're damn right I am. I've earned it. You think we live in some fairy tale where you just hoard everything until you die and the rest of us clap politely? You've always been like this, holding back, making us beg. I paid your tuition, I said. I helped with the down payment on your first house. I covered Evelyn's medical bills. I spent my life saving, sacrificing, planning. And now that I won't roll over and give you everything, suddenly I'm selfish. Gary didn't answer right away. His anger flickered, replaced by something colder, something that scared me more than his yelling ever could. You should be grateful we even let you stay in this house, he said. You think Louise stuck around because she loves you? She stayed because you were safe and quiet. But you're not useful anymore. You're just a burden. I stood, my legs steady despite the quaking in my chest. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The fire cracked behind me. If you believe that, then I've failed as a father. Not because I didn't give you enough, but because I didn't teach you what it means to earn something, to build it with your own hands." His voice dropped, low and cold. "You're going to regret this." "Maybe," I said, "but not as much as I'd regret letting you take what you haven't earned." He stormed out, the study door swinging open so hard it banged the wall. I stood alone in the warmth of the fire, every photograph on the mantel now looking like an artifact from a life that no longer existed. That night, I sat in the same chair, staring at the embers until they went cold. I felt the full weight of it then. I had lost my son. The boy I once held in my arms no longer lived inside the man who had just tried to extort me. But I hadn't lost myself. Not yet. And I was just getting started. The next morning, Louise didn't speak to me. She left a plate of toast and eggs on the counter like an afterthought and retreated to the sunroom to scroll her phone in silence. Dana sat on the porch, chain-smoking in her bathrobe, pretending not to notice the cold. Gary had left for an urgent meeting, though I suspected he needed to cool down and plan his next move. Later, I found Dana waiting in the kitchen, arms crossed, eyes sharp. "You know, Sebastian," she said, "you're being incredibly unfair." I raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? You think you're punishing Gary, but you're punishing the whole family. Evelyn, the kids, even me. You're just hoarding everything, like some kind of miser. For what? So you can die alone with your bank account full?" I laughed, short, bitter. "Is that what you think this is about? A grudge?" She leaned in. "You want to be respected? Then start acting like a patriarch. Provide. Support. Don't sit on a mountain of wealth while we struggle." I built that mountain, Dana. Stone by stone. I didn't ask for help. I didn't step on anyone to reach the top. Can you say the same? She bristled. "This family needs that money." "This family," I said evenly, "needs integrity more than it needs money." I walked away, leaving her stunned. In the days that followed, the requests came more subtly. Louise leaving property brochures on the coffee table, Evelyn texting me listings for home repair companies with cheerful emojis, Gary sending me emails with spreadsheets detailing projected ROI. They weren't asking anymore. They were circling, waiting for me to give in. But I didn't. Because beneath all the talk of repairs and investments, I saw the truth. This wasn't about a leaking pipe or a worn-out furnace. This was about greed dressed in family colors. This was about a son who had lost his way and a man who had finally found his spine. I might have lost my son, but I hadn't lost myself, and I never would. After the confrontation with Dana, I returned to my room, seeking refuge not in sleep, but in memory. On the top shelf of my wardrobe sat a photo album covered in worn leather and the dust of disuse. I pulled it down and settled into my armchair by the window, flipping it open like a book of sacred scripture. There was Gary at 5 years old, grinning with cake on his cheeks. The next photo, Gary on his first bicycle, a hand-me-down I had fixed up with new tires and a fresh coat of blue paint. He had never noticed the hours I spent after work, sanding, repainting, adjusting the brakes. Then came a photo from the summer of '99. I stood beside my old Chevy, the one I sold to pay for Gary's freshman tuition at college. I remember the ache in my chest as the car drove off with a stranger, the sting of parting with something that had carried our family through better years. But what mattered then was Gary's future. I turned the page to a picture of him in a cap and gown. That was the day I thought all the sacrifices were worth it. I'd spent years budgeting down to the dollar, taking on extra consulting gigs, cooking every meal at home to save for his education. I waited for him to say thank you. He never did. There were no photographs from the year Marjorie died. His mother, my rock. That year, Gary visited once, staying only for the funeral and flying back out that night for a conference. I grieved alone. I cooked, cleaned, buried the dead, and tended to the living shell of a house without even a phone call from my son for weeks afterward. A few pages later, there were pictures of family barbecues, birthday parties, holidays. I was there in all of them, behind the camera, setting up the grill, wrapping gifts, cleaning up the mess. They all smiled. I worked. The more I turned the pages, the more bitter the memories became. It wasn't the sacrifices I resented. It was that they had all been taken for granted. Everything I did had been treated like duty, not love. And now that I was old and inconvenient, they wanted to discard me like a used tool. I closed the album and placed it gently on the table beside me. Enough. I had been silent for too long. I had let guilt and duty dictate my actions, hoping for recognition that never came. But silence had become complicity, and I would no longer be complicit in my own erasure. Outside the window, snow began to fall, soft and slow. I watched it settle on the hedges, on the fence I built by hand, on the driveway I had shoveled for years without help. This house, this life, I had built them. I had earned every brick, every beam. I stood and walked slowly around the room. Each photo, each object, each faded ticket stub tucked into drawers told a story that mattered only to me. The family portraits on the wall now felt like caricatures, scenes from a play where I was never allowed a voice. I opened a drawer in the desk and pulled out the letters Marjorie used to write, her slanted handwriting spilling warmth even years after her passing. Her words echoed in my mind. Don't let them make you smaller than you are, Sebastian. You've given them your strength. Now keep your soul. Those words landed like an anchor in my chest. All the years I had folded myself to accommodate others' comfort, the lost dreams, the swallowed opinions, the dutiful silences. I had played the role of the humble father, the quiet provider. But I was more than that. This house had seen laughter and tears, births and deaths, joy and resentment. It was mine, and I would not allow the greed of those I once loved to rewrite the narrative of my life. I returned to the photo album, slipping between the pages a note addressed to myself. You are not a relic. You are a man still standing. Tomorrow I would call the lawyer again. I would write a letter, not a will, not yet, but a statement, a declaration of self, a legacy not defined by who would take what from me, but by what I chose to leave behind. The clock on the wall ticked softly. Midnight came and went. Snow coated the earth outside, blanketing it in silence. And I, at last, felt something settle in my chest that had eluded me for years. Resolve. This story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next morning, I called Loki. He answered after 2 rings, his voice scratchy with sleep and age. Sebastian, my favorite recluse. What did they do this time? Loki Frey was an old friend, an eccentric lawyer with a mind as sharp as a scalpel, and the sense of humor of a stray cat. We had met nearly 30 years ago over a disputed property line. Since then, he'd become the one man I trusted with both legal advice and bourbon. I need your help, I said. I want to dismantle them financially. A pause, then, that's not usually your tone. They've earned it. We met later that afternoon at Loki's cluttered office above a pawn shop on Devonshire Avenue. The space looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the 90s, but it smelled like old books and black coffee, comforting in a chaotic way. Papers covered every surface, and 2 cats patrolled the windowsills like sleepy guards. He greeted me with a nod and poured coffee into mismatched mugs. So, he said, sitting back in his creaky chair, tell me everything. And I did. I told him about the Christmas dinner, the ultimatum, the silence, the greed. About Dana's veiled threats and Gary's entitlement. About the years of sacrifice turned invisible, and the photo album that reminded me just how far I'd been pushed. He listened, nodding slowly, occasionally scribbling in a yellow notepad. When I finished, He leaned forward and said, "So we're going after their finances." "Yes. I know they're over-leveraged. They live in a house too big for their means. They drive cars they lease at rates they can barely afford. Gary's business isn't half as successful as he pretends. I want to hit them where they'll feel it." Loki grinned. "You want to teach them what it's like to struggle, to earn, not to expect. I can work with that." He opened a file drawer and began pulling forms. "We'll start with Dana. Her name's on that consultancy firm, right?" "Yes, but she's listed as a silent partner. Gary handles the deals. She signs off, which means she's on the hook if there's any mismanagement. If we can prove they've been misrepresenting assets, inflating profits for bank approvals—" "They have," I interrupted. "I've seen the statements. There's no way they're making what they claim to." Loki tapped his pen. "Good. We'll dig through everything. Bank records, credit files, business filings. Find the cracks and split them wide open." He pulled out a binder labeled with multicolored tabs. "We'll send anonymous tips to regulatory agencies. Quietly. We'll watch them scramble. Then we start applying pressure." I took a breath. "I don't want to ruin them. Just remind them who built the ground they're standing on." "Ruin and remind are closer than you think," he said, half smiling. "We'll start slow. No lawsuits yet. Just pressure. A nudge here, a notice there. Let them sweat. Make them look at each other over the dinner table and wonder who slipped up." We spent hours at his desk. He walked me through what we needed: documents, receipts, email chains, signatures. We discussed the loopholes in Dana's business filings, the potential liability if Gary's firm failed an audit, the inconsistencies in their property declarations. Loki's brilliance showed in his attention to the fine print, the quiet traps buried in bureaucracy. "You know what hurts people like them the most?" he asked as he lit a cigarette, ignoring the office's no-smoking sign. "Fear. The slow, gnawing kind. Fear of losing what they can't afford, of not knowing who's watching. We'll let them sit with that." I nodded. This was not a game. This was about principle. I had given them decades. It was time to take back my name. As I stood to leave, Loki handed me a folder. "What's this?" "Homework," he said. "Pull every document you have on them. Every receipt, every mortgage letter, every passive-aggressive birthday card with a check request scribbled inside. If you're going to make this hurt, we do it cleanly." Outside, the wind cut through my coat, but I didn't feel the cold. I felt purpose. On the way home, I drove past the mall where I once stood in line for 3 hours to buy Gary the bicycle he begged for. I passed the diner where Dana once cried to me over coffee about how hard things were starting out. I remembered all the times I had said yes, even when it cost me sleep, pride, or my last savings. They had mistaken kindness for weakness. They would not make that mistake again. The house was silent as the grave. Midnight had come and gone, and all the lights had been extinguished, save for the gentle glow of the oven clock in the kitchen. I waited until I heard the deep rhythms of sleep from upstairs before I moved. I crept from my room in wool socks, every step measured and slow. The floorboards knew me well, and I knew which ones to avoid. I made my way to the kitchen, where Gary kept a small filing cabinet beneath the side counter. I had watched him, year after year, tucking away folders there, expense reports, business statements, personal mail he didn't want Louise to see. The lock was cheap. I didn't need tools. A paperclip did the trick. Inside, it was a mess of folders stuffed with receipts, loan applications, credit statements, property tax notices. I sat at the kitchen table, the moonlight through the window giving just enough illumination to read. And what I found confirmed every suspicion. There were overdue notices on their home mortgage, 3 months behind. A foreclosure warning tucked at the bottom of a tax file, unopened. Gary's business account showed balances that dipped into red far more often than they should have. Dana's consulting firm had received loans based on inflated earnings projections. Their monthly spending exceeded their income by thousands. Designer clothes, luxury cars, lavish vacations they couldn't afford. They weren't just living beyond their means. They were digging a grave with golden shovels. I took out my phone and began photographing everything. Page by page, detail by detail. I photographed the loan terms, the forged earning statements, the creditor letters. I made a list in a small notebook I'd brought: dates, lenders, due amounts, account numbers. I was building a map of their collapse. Further in the files, I discovered that Gary had taken out a second mortgage on their home, this one co-signed without Dana's knowledge. That was dangerous, illegal even. I highlighted the pages with his signature and began drafting a secondary list just for Loki. The evidence would be damning. Dana's name popped up in a document that made me pause. It was a contract with a luxury PR firm, thousands of dollars for image consulting and executive brand curation. Their image meant more to them than solvency. I turned up invoices for private schooling for their children, spa treatments billed to the business account, even a yacht rental on a lake they never visited. I knew then this wasn't just poor management, it was pathological. Suddenly, I heard a creak. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming down the stairs. I moved quickly, silently slipping the folders back into place. I pushed the cabinet closed, slid into the pantry, and pulled the door nearly shut. I could see just a sliver through the gap. Gary entered the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, shuffling toward the fridge. He grabbed a bottle of water, unscrewed the cap, and drank in long gulps. He paused, squinting around. I held my breath. He stood there a moment longer, tilting his head slightly as though sensing something amiss. I pressed further into the shadows, willing the darkness to conceal every inch of me. After what felt like an eternity, he turned back toward the hallway, muttering to himself about the cold. I waited until his footsteps receded up the stairs. Gave it a full 2 minutes. Then I slipped out of the pantry, crossed the floor, and returned to my room as silently as I had come. I placed the photos into a hidden folder on my laptop, labeled it innocuously, insurance docs. Then I went to work. Each file was renamed, organized by type and date. I backed them up to an encrypted flash drive I kept in a hollowed-out copy of Moby Dick on my bookshelf. For hours, I examined the documentation with a financial scalpel, identifying the loans most vulnerable to recall, the contracts riddled with discrepancies, and the statements likely to trigger legal red flags. In a ledger, I recorded every infraction: false income declarations, forged co-signatures, overdue amounts camouflaged by temporary balance transfers. The deeper I went, the clearer the pattern became. Gary and Dana were not just careless, they were dishonest. Systematically so. I found references to phantom employees on Dana's business payroll, unclaimed bonuses, creative accounting that straddled the line between clever and criminal. One misstep with the IRS, and their empire of illusion would come crumbling down. I drafted anonymous letters, just templates for now, to key institutions: the IRS, the bank's fraud department, a financial regulatory watchdog. Names, figures, evidence, nothing actionable yet, but everything prepared. And still, I wasn't angry. I was awake, alive. I closed my laptop as the sky turned pale with dawn. The trap was no longer just set. It was baited, rigged, and gleaming with the promise of consequence. Now, all I needed was the right moment to spring it. I arrived at Loki's office just after noon, carrying a manila envelope thick with documentation. The air was sharp with winter, but I felt none of it. This wasn't vengeance. This was logistics. This was war by contract. Loki greeted me with his usual sarcastic grin, though his eyes scanned my face with something between concern and curiosity. You've got the look of a man who finally understands the value of a line in the sand. It's time, I said, sitting down and placing the envelope between us. We started with the will. My previous version, outdated and blind with trust, granted everything to Gary and Louise. Every last piece of my life's work, the fruit of my discipline, was meant to ensure their stability. That ends today. Let's start fresh, I said. New terms, new names, they get nothing. Loki nodded. You want it clean or scorched earth? Scorched, with salt. We moved piece by piece through my estate. Financial accounts, the house, the car, heirlooms, art, savings. I listed charitable organizations I had supported quietly for years, a scholarship fund for underprivileged students, medical research centers, an animal rescue initiative Marjorie once loved. Everything would be placed in trusts, doled out in perpetuity with clear stipulations. And the house? He asked. Protected by a holding company, a shell I control. Call it Holloway Holdings. Make it sound boring. Let Gary try to get his hands on it then. Loki chuckled. This will be as airtight as a tomb. Next, we drafted a power of attorney that transferred control of my affairs to a trustee, Loki himself, should anything happen to me. This ensured that even in decline my affairs would not fall into Gary or Dana's hands. No room for accusations, no opportunity to manipulate. We should also address your medical directives, Loki added. I agreed immediately. I remembered too well how Dana had hovered when I had a hospital scare last year, asking questions about insurance and health proxies more than my actual condition. My son had stood by, silent. Their concern had a scent to it, not love, but calculation. If I ever can't speak for myself, I want the attending physician and you to be in charge, not Gary, not Dana. Document that I am of sound mind. Include testimony if needed, video statements, whatever it takes. As we worked, I told Loki things I had held in for years. I spoke of the subtle shifts in my household, how Louise, in her later years, had begun treating Dana like the daughter she wished she had born, favoring her with whispered gossip, secret lunches, the best china. She laughed at Dana's jokes, encouraged her criticisms of me. Gary, ever the boy trying to win approval, had become the echo of his mother. He stopped questioning Dana's extravagances and started defending them, mimicking Louise's smirks, her dismissive sighs. It hurt to remember, but I recounted how Louise, in the final years of her life, had grown cold to my restraint. She called me stingy, backward, stubborn. She resented how I clung to old values, to prudence. Let the boy live, she used to say. He deserves ease. But I remembered the nights Gary had begged me for help paying rent during college, the weekends I worked overtime so he wouldn't have to drop out, the meals I skipped, the clothes I wore thin so my son could chase his ambitions. And when the success came, when the business suit and the fast car appeared, so too did the condescension. I watched my wife reward him for his arrogance, dismiss my sacrifice as mere obligation. We have to plan for every outcome, I said. If they challenge this, I want them to burn legal fees for nothing. Loki smiled grimly. Consider it done. By late afternoon, we had signed everything. The new will, the transfer of the house deed to the LLC, the freezing of any joint account still lingering from the past. The medical directives, contingency clauses, triggers for legal action, statements of full mental capacity, all in place. I signed with a steady hand. No tremor, no hesitation. Loki placed the signed papers into a thick binder and handed it to me. Keep this safe. One copy here, one with you. One goes in the safety deposit box we opened last year. And Sebastian, if they sniff around, don't flinch. They can't touch a single piece of it now. I nodded. My throat was dry, but not from nerves. As I stood to leave, Loki followed me to the door. "You're not the man I met years ago," he said. "You were quiet then, reserved. You've become formidable." "I spent years protecting everyone else," I replied. "It's time I learned to protect myself." I walked through the falling snow, back through a town filled with memories, past the shops where I once held Gary's hand, past the corner where Louise kissed my cheek every Friday for 30 years, past the shadows of a life I had lived with quiet pride. This wasn't grief anymore. This was resolve. The fortress was complete. Now, let them try and scale it. The plan had taken root. The documents were filed. The estate was untouchable. The house locked within an ironclad LLC. But I wasn't done. No, not yet. Strategy is only as good as its timing and its evidence. I knew they whispered behind closed doors. I knew Dana didn't trust that I would simply fade away like some obedient relic of the past. Gary lacked the foresight to worry, but she didn't. Her ambition was too sharp. I needed proof, tangible, undeniable proof of their intent. So, I waited. It was Thursday evening. Dana and Gary had returned from some dinner party, perfumed with too much wine and laughter. I feigned sleep, listening from upstairs as their voices bounced through the living room. They moved into the den, Dana's favorite room, decorated in faux modern style with angular furniture and her collection of overpriced, abstract art. I crept down an hour later, barefoot and silent, slipping into the shadowed kitchen. The door to the den remained slightly ajar. They never checked. I knew every board in this house, every creak and groan. I stayed low, tucked into the corner where the refrigerator's soft hum masked my breath. I turned on my phone and activated the recorder. Dana's voice, always smooth and perfectly paced, emerged first. "I told you, Gary. We need to get him out. He's an old man sitting on a gold mine. He doesn't need all that space." "You think he's going to just leave?" Gary's voice sounded unsure, boyish even. He had always shrunk in her presence. "No," she replied, a crispness entering her tone. "That's why we play the mental health card. You've seen how he's been acting, quiet, withdrawn. It won't be hard to convince a doctor, maybe even a judge. Early dementia, confusion. The way he stared into space the other day? It's perfect." Gary hesitated. "I don't know, Dana. He's still sharp. He noticed when I didn't file the home insurance forms." "That's exactly it," she snapped. "He's watching. We need to act first. Once we have a medical note, we push for assisted living, sell it as concern, then we move on the house. If he refuses, we escalate legally." I felt bile rise in my throat, but I held steady. Dana's voice took on a patronizing tone, the kind she used in front of Louise when she played the role of the caring daughter-in-law. I remembered how Louise used to light up when Dana praised her cooking, how she laughed at Dana's jokes even when they landed cruelly at my expense. Dana had become a shadow in our home, always present, always manipulative. "I've put up with his judgment for too long," she continued. "When your mother was alive, he barely let me speak. Louise saw it too, remember? She said he was stuck in the past, too stiff, too proud. She always said you were better off taking the reins." Gary murmured something I couldn't catch. Dana pushed further. "You want freedom? You want to raise your kids without him hovering in the background, judging our spending, questioning your decisions. This is the way. This house could be our future, an investment, a rental property. It's a waste, sitting here under his thumb." Gary sighed. "So, what do we say? That he's losing it? We say he's confused, agitated, possibly paranoid. You've seen the way he locks his door now. That's abnormal. We say we're worried. We sell it to his doctor. Play it safe. Then we get the papers moving." She paused, then added with a bitter laugh, "Besides, he's already cut us out of something. I know it." That envelope at Christmas wasn't just a note. He's hiding things. We need to act before it's too late. My hand trembled, but not from fear, from resolution. This was what I needed. I closed the recorder, every second captured. I had what they would never admit in the daylight. I slipped back into the hallway, listening to their laughter as they poured another glass of wine. I returned to my room, sat at my desk, and uploaded the file. 3 copies, encrypted and secured. One on my hard drive, one on an external flash drive, and one sent to Loki with a message. Phase 2 begins. Then I sat in the dark and let the full weight of their betrayal settle in. I remembered Dana's arrival into our lives, her bright smile, her empty compliments. I remembered how she would call Louise mom, how Louise would beam with approval. I remembered Gary's retreat from me, how every disagreement became ammunition for Dana to isolate him further. They had mistaken my silence for surrender, but now I had the truth. Not just suspicion, not just implication. Their voices, captured, scheming, plotting. Let them try now. I was ready. The next morning began with cold clarity. Frost coated every surface outside, but inside me, it was far colder. I rose from bed, dressed carefully, and grabbed my coat, gloves, and scarf. Prepared, I thought, for a brisk winter walk. But that wasn't what awaited me. I approached the front door of the house I had paid for, lived in, raised a family in. I had walked through that threshold countless times with grocery bags in hand, with Gary on my hip, with Louise's laughter echoing behind me. But this time, my key would not turn. I paused, confused, then tried again, turning the brass key harder. It didn't budge. I stepped back and inspected the lock. It gleamed, new, shiny. It hadn't been there yesterday. My pulse rose. I rang the bell, knocked. Once, twice, again. Eventually, the door opened just a crack. Gary stood behind it, hair tousled, eyes heavy, but alert. There was something different about him. Hesitation mingled with shame. "Dad," he said, "you should go." "What do you mean?" I asked. "You changed the locks?" Behind him, Dana appeared. She was dressed impeccably, as always, hair styled, makeup perfect, posture assertive. She folded her arms, leaning against the doorframe like she owned the place. "Gary made the decision for everyone's safety," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. I stared at my son. "You locked me out of my own house." Gary wouldn't meet my eyes. "Just until we figure things out." "What is there to figure out?" Dana interjected. "Your behavior lately, Sebastian. It's been unsettling. You've been distant, confused. Gary told me you went outside in your bathrobe in the middle of the night." "To get the paper," I said, nearly laughing. "Perception is everything," she said. I looked at Gary again. He looked small, smaller than he'd ever been. Smaller than when he first scraped his knee and ran to me crying. Smaller than when he'd begged me to co-sign his student loans. He was nothing now but a man who had handed his spine to his wife. "I see," I said. I stepped back. I would not beg. I turned and walked. My phone buzzed as I left the porch. Messages began flooding in, from my niece. "Uncle Sebastian, I heard you're not well. Gary says you might be confused a lot lately." From an old friend. "Hey Seb, just checking in. Heard you've been forgetting things? Hope you're okay." Even distant cousins chimed in with thinly veiled concern. It was coordinated, deliberate. Dana was poisoning the well. I found myself at the park bench where I used to read to Gary every Saturday morning. He loved fairy tales back then. Dragons, brave knights. Once, he had said I was his favorite knight. I laughed then. It was a beautiful memory, one they had now desecrated. I called Loki. He answered on the first ring. "They've changed the locks," I said, "and the rumors, they're spreading fast." "So, they've chosen war," he said. "Yes, I replied. Now we show them what a war with me really looks like. Loki's voice dropped to a growl. I'll begin proceedings immediately. They've just made their biggest mistake. I hung up and watched the snow fall. Then I thought of Louise, how she once loved Dana, how she encouraged their spending, praised Dana's poise. I remembered the dinners when Louise would scold me for being too harsh, for not trusting Gary enough. She never saw how Dana chipped away at him, how she drove a wedge between us. I tried to warn Louise once, told her Dana was too controlling, too focused on appearances. Louise told me I was paranoid, but even she, before her death, had begun to doubt. One night, after Gary stormed out over some minor disagreement, Louise whispered, "Maybe we were too soft on him. Maybe we made him weak." It was the closest she ever came to admitting what I had known all along. As the snow thickened around me, I reached into my coat pocket and ran my fingers over the envelope Loki had given me. Documents, recordings, power of attorney, medical directives, and the insurance that now stood like a fortress around my legacy. They thought they'd silenced me, but they had only triggered the avalanche. War had begun, and I was no longer a knight. I was the dragon. Word travels fast in a family infected by gossip. By Sunday morning, I'd received more curious texts and polite inquiries from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years than I could count. Gary had cast the net wide. They were setting the stage, and they had chosen Christmas as the battlefield. It was my cousin Laura who confirmed it in hushed tones over the phone. "Just so you're not blindsided, Gary said he plans to speak at the Christmas dinner. Something important. Just wanted you to be prepared." I thanked her and ended the call, sitting in silence as the old grandfather clock ticked behind me. I knew what it was. The culmination of their campaign. Their attempt to label me unfit, unstable, and unworthy in front of the entire family. Publicly. Formally. Irreversibly. But they were forgetting one thing. I still held the truth. The following 3 days passed in slow, calculating preparation. Loki and I met twice more in person. We finalized every document, checked the audio recordings, printed the transcripts, and organized a bundle so damning, so meticulously ordered that no one could doubt its authenticity. Every page in that folder had a purpose, an accusation wrapped in a fact, a dagger sheathed in legal terms. Among the documents were bank records showing Gary and Dana's spiraling debts, forged signatures, and even tampered receipts from house-related expenses meant to cover up frivolous spending. Loki even included a notarized statement of my mental competency from an independent psychologist, dated just the week before. But the centerpiece, the core, was the recording. Their voices conspiring, mocking, and plotting. I rehearsed my words like a surgeon preparing for an incision. No performance, no emotion, just precision. And then, Christmas Eve came. I arrived early, wearing the same navy suit I'd worn to Louise's funeral. It still smelled faintly of lavender and starch. The air was crisp, the sky heavy with the promise of snow. The house was aglow with soft lights and garlands. Relatives buzzed inside with wine and laughter, exchanging hugs and clinking glasses. Dana, resplendent in crimson silk, moved through the crowd like a practiced queen, charming and poised. She kissed cheeks, refilled drinks, and laughed that affected laugh she always used when she wanted to be seen. Gary shadowed her, nervously pulling at his collar and eyeing the clock. When I stepped inside, the room quieted just a fraction. Eyes shifted. Conversation slowed. Dana was the first to break the silence. "Sebastian, how brave of you to come." I smiled with all the warmth I could muster. I wouldn't miss it. Dinner passed in a blur of strained smiles and guarded glances. Dana ensured I was seated at the far end of the table, away from her, beside the window. She made a show of topping off Gary's glass and whispering into his ear while I chewed through dry turkey and overcooked ham. She passed bread to cousins, complimented Aunt Sarah's pudding, and never once addressed me directly. She treated Gary like a king and his sister-in-law like a lady of court. I watched as she manipulated each moment, spinning her own narrative in silence. Gary sat too straight, too rehearsed, like a man waiting for his cue, and it came, just after dessert. He stood slowly, glass in hand. The room fell into expectant silence. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight," he began. "I know the holidays are a time for love and reflection, and sometimes for difficult conversations." Dana's smile widened, her chin lifted slightly. Gary cleared his throat. "We've noticed some changes in my father recently, some confusion, some unusual behavior, and after much consideration, Dana and I believe it's time to have an honest discussion about his well-being, for his safety and ours." Gasps fluttered around the table. A few exchanged glances. Others turned toward me with a mix of concern and curiosity. I rose slowly. "Thank you, Gary," I said, my voice calm, steady. "But before we go further, I have a gift, one for you and one for everyone here." From beneath my coat, I pulled out the thick folder, bound in black, crisp, heavy, symbolic. I walked the length of the table and placed it directly in front of him. "Your farewell gift," I said. He opened it, eyebrows raised in confusion. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the pages. Then he reached the transcript, the audio, the legal notices, the notarized letter, and I watched his face fall apart. Dana leaned over trying to snatch the folder from his hands, but I held up a second copy. "Don't worry, Dana. I made one for you too." She froze, her jaw tightening. Gary's face drained of color. "Where did you— how did you—" "I heard everything," I said. "Every word, every plan, every lie." The room was dead silent now. Forks frozen midair, glasses untouched. I will not be labeled. I will not be erased. And I will not be removed from the home I built, the life I earned. Dana tried to recover, laughing nervously. "This is absurd. He's trying to turn the tables." I cut her off. "No, Dana. You turned them. I just flipped them back." Gary's hands shook as he looked up, eyes wide with something between fear and fury. "Checkmate," I whispered. And then he started screaming. Gary's scream echoed through the room, slicing through the fragile tension like a razor. The gasps from relatives felt like the creaking of old floorboards just before collapse. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the documents, scattering them across the pristine white tablecloth like shrapnel from a bomb. "Is that your voice, Gary?" Uncle Victor asked again, more firmly this time, rising slightly in his chair. Gary looked around the room like a man drowning in his own guilt. This is out of context," he barked, voice cracking. Dana grabbed the folder, flipping through it with furious fingers. Her face turned from indignation to disbelief, to fear. "These are private conversations. He's spying on us." "No," I said calmly, still standing. "I was listening. There's a difference." Cousin Melanie picked up a page from the floor. "Eviction orders? Frozen accounts? Gary, what is this?" And there it was. Every detail of their failed heist laid bare. The bank statements proving Gary and Dana had maxed out multiple credit cards under aliases, the notarized freeze orders, transcripts of their conspiracy. Loki had included legal opinions too, outlining the consequences of elder abuse, financial manipulation, and defamation. Dana's voice turned shrill. "This is all twisted. We were trying to help him. He's not well. Look at this obsession with paperwork." "You tried to have me committed," I said. "You told people I was losing my mind. You wanted to steal everything I built, but instead, you destroyed yourselves." Even Aunt Helen, who had always sided with Dana's charm, stood silent. No one moved. No one defended them. I looked around the table, the same table where I once carved turkeys, where Louise had laughed and poured gravy, where Gary had fallen asleep with cranberry sauce on his cheek. That place was gone. Dana's grip on the narrative had always been cunning. She wrapped Gary in validation, built him up with false praise while subtly shifting the blame for every misstep onto me. When Louise was alive, she played the loyal daughter-in-law, gushing over meals, volunteering to help clean up, offering Louise flattery that sparkled like broken glass. But after Louise died, Dana's mask began to slip. She weaponized compassion, painting herself as the peacemaker, the stabilizer. Behind every soft-spoken word lay a scheme, and Gary, ever desperate for approval, followed blindly. Dana treated Gary like an accessory to her ambition, groomed him to doubt me, to believe he was entitled to more. She turned him against his own legacy. And in doing so, she lost everything. "I'll be taking my leave," I said quietly, but clearly. "There's nothing left for me here." No one stopped me. I walked out of that house not as a broken man, but as someone reborn. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, soft, steady, clean. In the following days, Loki and I moved swiftly. The LLC filed the sale of the property. Realtors were contacted, the house listed. I signed over everything necessary while sipping black coffee in Loki's downtown office, the sun rising behind me like a curtain lifting on a new act. Gary left voicemails that turned from pleading to threats to silence. Dana sent 2 curt emails, one with legal jargon and another just the word monster. I deleted them all. Within a week, I'd moved into a new home across the river. A modest cottage with ivy on the trellis, a small greenhouse in the back. It didn't carry ghosts. It carried only space, air, quiet. I unpacked the photo of Louise, one of the few things I'd brought, and placed it on the mantel. She was laughing in it, standing next to a young Gary with a missing tooth and eyes filled with wonder. They were gone now, Louise to time, and Gary to greed. I spent the first night on the porch, wrapped in a wool blanket, a glass of bourbon in hand, watching snow gather on the railings. The silence was not emptiness, it was peace. That dinner had been my funeral, my reckoning and my resurrection. The final act of a play they thought they had written. But I had turned the page. Goodbye to the man who stayed quiet. Goodbye to the father they tried to bury. I was not erased, I was rewritten. And this time, the pen was in my hand. And as I began this new chapter, I knew one thing with certainty. I would never again let anyone write my story for me. The legacy I built was mine, and so was the peace I had finally earned. In the stillness of winter, I had reclaimed everything that mattered, my voice, my dignity, and my freedom. The snow continued to fall as I stood and went back inside. It was time to begin living again.